Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. My name is Alan Dunbar. I'm singing this afternoon on the concert. I also live up in Winona. I teach music at Winona State University, and I have been tasked the wonderful pleasure of talking to you a little bit about the music that's on the program for today. Do you all have programs? You can see what's slated for this afternoon. There are three pieces on the program today: a cello sonata by Beethoven, a group of songs by German composer Hans Eisler, and then the first string quartet by Russian composer Sergei Prokofiev. We'll start with the Beethoven. We'll just sort of talk through them a little bit in order so that you have a sense of what to expect, what you're going to hear, and maybe be able to hang on to some of those nuggets of information and hear them when they pop up in the music and the performance today. So the first piece on the program will feature Garrett and Ruth playing cello. This is a piece by Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven was born in Bonn, Germany in 1770. He eventually settled in Vienna, which was sort of the cultural hub of Western Europe at that time, and then traveled throughout Europe, mostly as a concert pianist, but also composing a lot along the way. Beethoven's music, if you're not really familiar with Beethoven, but you've probably heard some of his stuff, like the Symphony No. 5 and the Symphony No. 9, and perhaps some of the chamber music. They've certainly done a fair amount of it here at Apollo over the years. But his style is really firmly rooted in the big C classical era style. So if we think of composers like Mozart and Haydn, sort of that last half of the 1700s, Beethoven is definitely rooted in that style. But as he moved through his career, he started to expand on what those previous classical composers had done and really set the foundations for now what we refer to as big R romantic music that happened a lot during the 1800s, the 19th century. Beethoven was really successful in composing in a lot of different genres of classical music. He wrote symphonies. Those are some of the things that he's most famous for. He wrote solo concertos for solo instruments and orchestra. He wrote a lot of solo piano works, sonatas for solo instruments and piano, wrote some wonderful chamber music, wrote some art songs, and even wrote one opera that still gets performed with some frequency. These sonatas for cello and piano, there are 5 total, and they're really interesting in that they give us a clear progression of his style throughout his career. The first 2 sonatas, and we're going to hear the very first one today, from Opus 5, those are written early in his career in 1796. The Opus 69 is right in the middle of his career, and then the Opus 102, sonatas 1 and 2 of that opus number, were from later in his career. And we can kind of see how Beethoven's style shifts as we move through those 5 cello sonatas, especially in the way that the cello and the piano interact. Opus 5 was originally published as a sonata for piano with cello obbligato, meaning that the cello was there to be a nice melody instrument that interacted with a piano sonata. By Opus 69, and definitely by the time we get to those later ones, the Opus 102 sonatas, the writing is a lot more equal for both instruments, and we'll talk a little bit about why that happened. And they get much more demanding in terms of style and character. With the early sonatas, it's pretty fair to say that Beethoven was instrumental in establishing a new kind of form, for a new genre for the cello. There were some pieces written for cello and keyboard instrument before Beethoven's first cello sonata, but it's with that first cello sonata that we really see the genre of a cello sonata, a solo piece for cello and keyboard instrument, start to develop. At the time that this first cello sonata, Opus 5, number 1, was written, the keyboard instrument that we now know as the piano, a pianoforte, was still a really new instrument. Up until that point, the main keyboard instrument was the harpsichord. And if you know about the difference between a harpsichord and a piano, harpsichords, the way that the strings make sound is they're plucked. There's a little thing, when you press down on the key, a little piece goes up, and there's a hard plectra sticking out from the side of that, and it plucks the string. There's not a lot of sustain with the harpsichord. You play the note, and it dies pretty quickly. With the piano, have all of you looked inside a piano at some point? There's like rows and rows of hammers in there, right? You push down on a piano key, and through lots of levers and lots of mechanics, the hammer hits the string, and as long as you keep your finger down on the key or you push your foot down on the sustain pedal, that note will just continue to ring for a long time. So the development of the piano was really in the throes of this time period, right around the end of the 18th century. So in this piece, the pianoforte really hadn't developed enough to be a full equal partner to what the cello can do by itself. So it had a lighter weight tone, still a somewhat limited sustain to it. And so in this, to be able to balance the cello's ability to sustain really long and play a really full sound, Beethoven had to write it in a way that the cello didn't overpower the piano. So we have lots of faster moving notes, lots of scales and arpeggios in both the piano and the cello part, so that we get a little bit more equal balance. The two sonatas of this opus, opus number 5, were written in 1796 while Beethoven was visiting Berlin, Germany. He had traveled from his home in Vienna to Prague in February of that year and was planning to just go back to Vienna, but his concert tour was really successful. He wrote a letter to a friend, to his brother actually, saying, quote, "He was getting on well, very well. My art is winning for me friends and respect." And so he had a good thing going, and he just decided to keep riding that train. So he wound up in Berlin, and by way of Dresden and Leipzig, and he got to Berlin in May of 1796 and stayed at the court of King Friedrich Wilhelm II, who was an accomplished musician in his own right. And while Beethoven was there, he wrote these two cello sonatas for Jean-Pierre Dupont, who was an influential cellist at the time and actually became an important cellist for developing teaching curriculum for learning how to play the cello. And these two cello sonatas of Opus 5 were premiered by Dupont and Beethoven in early 1797, and both of them are dedicated to King Wilhelm II. The first sonata is in F major, and it only has two movements, though both of them are pretty substantial movements. The first movement, as you see in your program, is labeled Adagio sostenuto, and then Allegro. So in this first movement, we get sort of an introduction that's almost like a movement by itself. But Beethoven marks it as an introduction into the rest of the Allegro part of that movement. It unfolds gradually with lots of arpeggios, so figures going up and down the notes of a chord on this F major chord, and that's our key, and Beethoven loves to remind us of the key that we're in. And we also see these arpeggios in F major show up once we get to the Allegro, the fast section in this first movement. Finally, we hear a melody that shows up first in the piano and then gets repeated in the cello. There's a long sort of bridge section that ties us from this introductory part of the Allegro fast section with lots of offbeat accents. So listen for those syncopated accents. Then that leads us to a section of lots of scales running up and down, first in the piano, and then the cello enters with a little bit more melodic idea that leads us to a development section where Beethoven then takes bits of that first section and chops it up into little parts and plays with it, moves us into different key areas. And then finally, he brings us back to the recapitulation of that first opening material. So a restatement of what we started with. It'll sound familiar when we get to that part, when Ruth and Garrett come to that recap section. The second movement is an Allegro vivace, which means just really fast. And you'll hear that in both parts. Lots and lots of fast moving notes. It has lots of chords that very strongly reinforce the fact that we're in F major, especially by the end. It's a rondo, which means that we have multiple sections that come back and forth. We have sort of an A, B, A, C, A, and so on and so forth as that develops. And it's in 6/8 time. We'll hear the rhythmic back and forth play between the two instruments. There are a lot of descriptions of this movement as being bucolic or rustic or country-like. You can be the judge of that if you hear something that sounds like bucolic and rustic in it. One writer even said that we can almost see the beer glasses swaying and hear them clinking. However you hear it, though, this second movement, the rondo, second allegro vivace movement, is full of energy. It's a wonderful, wonderful way to end this piece. I asked Ruth if she had any tidbits that she wanted to share, and some of the information that I've already shared with you is from Ruth. But I thought I would include that her favorite performance of this piece is one that she and Garrett did together back in 2020, in a performance when they did all 5 of Beethoven's cello sonatas in one concert in St. Paul. And evidently, this was just a barn burner of a performance for that one. So I hope you enjoy that Beethoven cello sonata. There are a lot of great things to listen for in that. The second section of music in your program are selections from a collection of songs called the Hollywood Liederbuch, or the Hollywood Songbook, by German composer Hans Eisler. Eisler was born in Vienna in 1898, and he died in East Berlin in 1962. He was a star pupil of Viennese composer Arnold Schoenberg, who is considered to be one of the most important early 20th century composers. He developed a technique called 12-tone serialism, was a big proponent of early 20th century avant-garde music, and a lot of people thought that it sounded crazy and didn't know what to make of it. But a lot of people thought it was the future for what classical music was going to be in the 20th century. Eisler even lived with Schoenberg and his wife for a while so that he could really be immersed in his studies with Schoenberg. But the two of them had a bit of a falling out. Schoenberg was very content to be a successful avant-garde, cutting-edge composer in Vienna in the early 1900s. And Eisler leaned a little bit more towards the left side of the political spectrum. He was connected to various socialist and communist circles in Vienna at the time, and he disapproved of Schoenberg's attitude about art and society. And so they had a bit of falling out, we could say, and Eisler moved to Berlin, where he lived for a few years. But in addition to being socialist, he was also Jewish. And by 1933, in fear of his safety, he left Germany and went to New York City, where he taught for a couple of years, and then made his way, like so many other European expats, refugees during the war. He wound up in Los Angeles, where he actually even ran into his old teacher Schoenberg, who had moved to Los Angeles as well. Eisler wrote music for the film industry. I think he was even nominated for an Academy Award for one of his film scores. And while he was in Los Angeles, he wrote this large collection of songs called the Hollywood Songbook. It's about 47 songs total. These are written between mid-1942 and December of 1943. In 1947, Eisler's own sister, who had also immigrated to the United States, she testified against him in the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings. And he was deported in 1948, and he decided to go back to Germany, which at that point was in tatters after the war. But he went to East Berlin and East Germany and became one of the main composers for the East German state. He actually wrote the national anthem for East Germany. And he lived in East Berlin until he died in 1962. Now, most people know of Eisler's name because the conservatory, the music conservatory in Berlin, is called the Hans Eisler Conservatory. Most people know his name from the connection to that conservatory. The Hollywood Songbook, though, again, was written between 1942 and 1943, and is a total of about 47 songs, mostly settings of poetry by German poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht, who was a contemporary and a friend of Eisler's. There are a few other songs that, I think there are a couple that Eisler wrote the texts himself. There are one or two that are in English, a few that are in French, a few that are German translations of an ancient Greek poet named Anacreon, and then a set of songs by the German Romantic poet Friedrich Hölderlin. If you look at I think there's an insert in your program, is there not? That has the list of the songs that Garrett and I are going to perform today, along with translations. And when we get to that set in the performance today, I strongly encourage you to follow along with those translations. All of the songs in the Hollywood Songbook, they speak to Eisler's experience of being someone in exile, of being away from his home, the place where he wants to be but can't be. And all of these songs deal with that in some way. Most of them feel rather bleak. There's a sense of loss, a sense of sadness to most of these songs, although there are a couple that are fairly lighthearted. The fourth one on the list, Der Kirschdieb, that means the cherry thief. It's a story of the narrator is talking about waking up in his bed and hearing some whistling out in the garden, and he looks out the window, and he sees a young man sitting in the cherry tree in his garden stealing all the cherries out of his cherry tree. And that even long after the guy has left, he still hears that whistling, coming through the window. Another one that's a little more uplifting is 4 from the end, Vom Sprengen des Gartens, that means about watering the garden. And in that text, he talks about not only watering all of the plants that we love, but also water the weeds and the grass, and actually water the bare earth too. Put some water on the dirt. Who knows what's going to grow there? And to me, it feels like a song about hope. That maybe if we put our efforts in places that even don't seem like anything will happen, that something positive could happen from that. The last 3 pieces are poems by that German Romantic poet Friedrich Hölderlin. And Eisler adapted the original poems to more specifically speak to his experience of being in exile. The next to last song, An eine Stadt, the original title of that poem is Heidelberg, meaning the city in central Germany. There's a very, very old university there, and in that song text, you'll hear me sing about a bridge over the river, a many-arched bridge, and that bridge is still there in Heidelberg. And speaking about the beauty of that city and of the landscape around it, and again, the longing for home. And then in the last piece, Remembrance, the text deals with feelings of Eisler's homeland being ravaged, being taken advantage of, and yet, at the end of it, there is definitely hope that as people come back, as things are rebuilt, that something good may come out of all of that. So, I hope you enjoy those songs by Eisler. I look forward to hearing your reactions to them after the concert. The last piece that's on the program for today is Sergei Prokofiev's String Quartet No. 1 in B minor. This is a piece that was written in 1931 after Prokofiev had done an extended concert tour in the United States. Prokofiev's style was rooted both in the more Western European classical tradition as well as a more Russian nationalist tradition. This string quartet is written in 3 movements. We have an allegro, fast first movement. The second movement is a scherzo. Most of it is fast, but we get a sort of medium slow section at the beginning of that second movement, and then it really takes off. The marking in the score is vivace, which means pretty darn quick. The last movement, the andante movement, is probably the best known, and it was Prokofiev's favorite part of this piece. This piece was written, as I said, after he had done an extended tour, and he was commissioned by the US Library of Congress to write this piece. In his autobiography, Prokofiev wrote, speaking of the Library of Congress, he wrote, "This huge library has a much poorer collection of original manuscripts than most European libraries. To remedy this deficiency, a special fund has been set up for purchasing the original manuscripts of modern composers. Of course, in time, hardly more than 1 out of 10 compositions will be of any value, but by then it will be worth 10 times what it was originally paid for it. The new compositions are performed with a great deal of ceremony at music festivals in Washington, to which musicians from New York and other cities are invited. Before starting work on the quartet, I studied Beethoven's quartets. That's interesting. Chiefly in railway carriages on my way from one concert to another. In this way, I came to understand and greatly admire his quartet technique. Perhaps this explains the somewhat classical idiom of the first movement of my quartet. It has, however, 2 distinctive features. First, the finale is the slow movement of the whole quartet. So he doesn't end with something fast like most quartets. He ends with something slow. And secondly, the key of B minor is one rarely chosen for quartets. I ended the quartet with a slow movement because the material happened to be the most significant of the whole piece. As for the key, the tonic of B minor is just a half tone below the limits of the cello and viola range. This involves a number of difficulties in writing the music. I tried out the andante from the quartet with a full string orchestra, rewriting some of the cello part and adding a part for the double basses. One would think that the andante, being for the most part melodious, ought to sound richer in the orchestra, but in fact, it is better as a quartet. The first performance of the quartet took place in Washington on April 23rd, 1931. So Prokofiev, as you can tell from that last little bit, was really proud of that andante last movement. He felt like it was really good stuff. He transcribed it not only for string orchestra, as we heard him mention in that passage from his autobiography, but he also transcribed it for solo piano, where it shows up in as number 5 of the 6 pieces for piano, opus 52. Prokofiev's composer friend Miaskovsky wrote, quote, "There is true profundity in the sweeping melodic line and intensity of the finale. This movement strikes deep." And this next little bit is kind of a dig, and it actually panned out well for Prokofiev. But his friend writes, "How marvelous it would be if this tendency in him were to become firmly fixed." There have been some people who have described this last movement as gloomy. I don't think that it's gloomy. It is perhaps the more serious contemplative side of Prokofiev's personality that was just starting to come into focus a bit more in that early 1930s. The first movement is in strict classical sonata form. So we get, just like in the Beethoven first movement, we get an exposition, that first section where we get some themes introduced. We get a development section where he's going to chop it up into little bits and play with it a bunch. And then we're going to get a recap again. The second movement, that scherzo that starts off a little slow and then gets going, has a lot of rhythmic drive that sets in after that slow introduction. And that slow part at the beginning of the second movement also hints a little bit at the mood and melodic shapes that we see in that third movement, andante finale section. And that last movement, we feel it start, we feel it grow and unfold, and we get to the big peak moment in the piece, and then it gradually sinks back into what feels like quiet and dark. So there's a real beautiful shape to that last movement. I hope that you enjoy all 3 of these composers that are represented on this program. It's a really wide range of music, and a lot of wonderful things represented here. So hopefully this has helped give you a little bit of insight into what you're going to hear today. And again, look forward to talking with you about all of it afterwards. Thank you so much.